And for me, what were the goals? Look good naked, not sleep so much, and to work hard. What happens if you're a 20-something-year-old who's probably overworking himself thinking that he's optimizing their health by doing all these CrossFit workouts? Where do you go when you want to go from 80 to 100? We do have people that like to go full Smurf, and we encourage you to do what you like to a certain extent. But we want the benefits of nicotine because you and I are both in the biohacking space for a long time. We know that there's many benefits of it. When you start to travel around the world with a degree of frequency, what you actually do is you start to notice things like memory loss. I had somebody that told him, I don't have time to meditate. And he's like, well, then you need 3 hours to meditate, right?
Yeah.
Anytime I spend meditating, it usually pays off 3 to 5x than what the time takes.
It has a little bit of hemp, right? So
yeah, so hemp crystals beatifically derived is what we like to call it.
Beatifically derived. Hey, Boomer, it's so great to be with you today and have you on the show. I'm excited to have you here.
Angela, it's great to be here. I know we have a lot of mutual friends, so it's finally good to catch up in this way.
We do indeed. And so it's great to finally meet, and hopefully one day it'll be in person. We won't have to do it remotely like this on Zoom. But so let's kick off with, because I know you're in a very similar area to me in terms of health coaching for performance. And like me, you have a bit of a checkered background, not in law, but in investment banking. So can you just give us a bit of an intro on how you went from investment banking to getting into health and performance?
Oh, how long do we have here? This is a very good question. So my entire life, I've been obsessed with this idea of performance, right? And I'm sure you felt a similar way growing up, whether it was academics, athletics. I just wanted to live at that next level. And that eventually dragged me into Wall Street, where, ironically, I started my Wall Street career, if you will, on September 15th, 2008, which was the day that Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy and AIG got nationalized. So it was a I guess ominous, if you will, start, but it was a great time to be at the bank, and because I was able to advance pretty fast. After 2 years, I got sent to Singapore. I was supposed to be there for 2 years, lived there for 6, and at the age of 25 or something like that, I had this really great job of running a financing desk across all of South Asia. So my territory was basically from India to Indonesia. During this time, I actually thought I was healthy, and I was doing, everything from mixed martial arts to crazy CrossFit 10 times a week, and to, following whatever the diet of the day was. And around that time, I was also getting into this idea of quantified self. And back then it was these really esoteric forums on the internet, and you would kind of use these N of 1 experiments to see how to better yourself. And for me, what were the goals? It was simply to look good naked, to not sleep so much, and to work hard. You kind of know how this story ends.
Fair
right?
enough goals, right? They're pretty similar to my own.
Yeah. And so you kind of know how this story ends. When you're not sleeping, when you're changing time zones pretty much every week, and you're stressed out of your mind. Well, at the age of 30, I found myself getting diagnosed with a little bit of a heart condition. And at that point, you kind of look at it and say, okay, somebody gives you a probability weighted outcome of you having a cardiac event, or I can choose another path. And around that time, my now fiance and I decided to really investigate living somewhere else. At this point, I'd lived most of my life in the United States and a good portion of my life in Singapore. And so Europe became a natural alternative. And I also became very, very interested in my own health because of that condition. And the way I went about, I guess you can say, remedying or getting it under control was very methodical, data-driven. And after I started making progress, feeling better, seeing, just looking better and performing better, I had some former colleagues that were like, hey, can you do this for me? I had no intention of ever getting into this coaching realm, but sometimes an opportunity presents itself, and I like the people that I was working with. Fast forward a number of years later, we can get into sort of the frameworks that I work with now, because that has a lot to do with health optimization, medicine, and practice. But I just really enjoy working with entrepreneurs. And so what I like to do is to help people change the world. And because, I'm only one person, how do you do that? Well, I look at entrepreneurs and executives in these types. And these are people that are making decisions which could have a knock-on impact of changing the world. And how they treat the people that report to them, it really, really matters. And so, trickle down effect in this case does work. And so I look at sort of entrepreneurs as that Archimedes lever for me to help change the world. And if I could change their perspective on health, hopefully it'll help change the perspective of others.
Very true. Amazing. I love that. And so when you're looking at the parameters with them, we're obviously going to get into like optimizing things like nootropics. And I definitely want to talk to you about the work you're doing with transcriptions.
Mm-hmm.
But firstly, looking then at how can you optimize these individuals and help them to perform better? You mentioned yourself that you were pretty burnt out by 30, you had this heart condition, and yet ostensibly you seemed fit, right? You were doing things like CrossFit. So that's been very similar to my own journey in terms of finding where does the balance rely, right? And I always think we've got this push and pull mechanism of creating resilience and then dialing it back and recovering. And for me, I definitely have to remind myself to recover harder than I would naturally do all of the time. But from your perspective, what are you finding in terms of that health optimization, in terms of kind of habits, lifestyle, fitness? How does it all kind of fit together for you and for your clients?
Yeah, sure. If it's okay with you, I'd actually like to spend just a moment here talking about the non-for-profit foundation, which I work for. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Yeah,
Because
go
that
for it.
actually helps provide the framework, if you will. And so Transcriptions, which is a company that I spend the majority of my time on, has a sister company called Health Optimization Medicine and Practice. And that's a nonprofit. It's based in the United States. We also have, I guess you can say little, I don't know if you call them daughter companies or whatever you want to call it, daughter nonprofit foundations around the world in places like Australia, Philippines, here in the Netherlands. And what health optimization medicine and practice is really Dr. Ted Achikoso, who's my mentor. What he's looking to establish is a framework to help educate doctors and practitioners on how to optimize for health. Now, let me explain that a little bit, because immediately when we say that, that needs a little bit of clarification. If you think about the word healthcare, right, I kind of chuckle a little bit about it in the sense that going back to my investment banking days, the industry vertical of healthcare was predominantly, biotech, health insurance companies, and the like pharma. But all of these companies were really focused on how to treat and cure disease. And look, some of them do it very, very well, and they deserve to be rewarded. I have no qualms with that or capitalism or anything like that. But when you start looking at what you actually use healthcare for, it's actually for disease management. And so what happens if you're a 20-something-year-old who's probably overworking himself, thinking that he's or she is, optimizing their health by doing all these CrossFit workouts, and it sounds like some of the things that you're doing, Angela, as well. But where do you go when you're looking to just not only protect your downside, but optimize for more? Where do you go when you want to go from 80 to 100? And so Dr. Ted actually developed this framework called health optimization medicine and practice. And what we do is a rigorous amount of testing to assess really the health of something called your holobiont. And the holobiont is really, just to give you a little bit of a framework around that, is it's an idea proposed by Dr. Lynn Margolis in the early 90s. And essentially goes that, our cells are actually made up of a symbiotic relationship between mitochondria and other ancient bacteria. And we also have other constituent organisms within our bodies. You have things like the gut microbiome, you have the skin microbiome, you have, obviously the oral microbiome, if we're going to go down that route. You have the virome, you have fungi called the mycobiome. And collectively, all of these organisms make up something called the holobiont. And so what we actually propose is that you're the health of your organisms, right? And so what we do with health optimization medicine and practice is put people, or we educate doctors and practitioners on how to optimize for health. And what does that look like practically, which gives you insight in sort of how I do this with my clients is that we start testing people at a cellular level using something called metabolomics. We then look at sort of different frameworks on how to optimize their health, things like chronobiology. We look at evolutionary biology. We look at mitochondrial health, like bioenergetics, epigenetics, and a whole host of others to really assess you. And what we're actually doing there is nutrient balancing, and in some cases, if you're able to prescribe, hormone balancing. And so that's really the framework by which I've adopted in my own health consulting practice, and actually gives everybody here listening a little bit of an overview of what we do in the foundation.
Interesting. So in terms of, that sounds like it would start with pretty extensive testing, so that you've actually got data to work with. What would you be looking at if you had someone come to you and you're trying to assess where their baseline health is right now?
Absolutely. I mean, we'll start with just sort of that framework, and if you want me to, I can go in sort of a lower cost framework later. But what we do is we give everybody blood, urine, and stool tests. It's one is a food sensitivities test. One is a plasma and urine micronutrient deficiency test. And the other one is a 3-day stool test. And what we're looking to do there is assess for nutrient imbalances on the case of the Genova NutriVal, which is the micronutrient test. We're looking for low-grade inflammation in the gut in the form of food sensitivities. And then we're also looking for the presence of things like dysbiosis or imbalances of bacteria in the gut, if you will, with the GIFX, which is the 3-day stool test that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the 3-day one is good, isn't it? Because you don't actually shed everything every day.
I am so glad you said that, because it's funny because there's so many people out there that there's a lot of commercially available gut microbiome tests, and you do one sample, right? But how many times do people clear their entire intestinal tract in one sample?
Yeah.
Probably.
Well, they don't. I tell you what surprises me is that if you go to a doctor, okay, they will only ever do 1 day if someone's ill and there's some sort of pathogen that they suspect, even though we know they don't shed every day. And what's so crazy is that we treat our dogs better. So my first experience when I had my golden retriever, like 12 years ago, was, and he had an upset stomach. The first thing the vet did was ask me to do a 3-day stool sample. And it just seems crazy that in the UK, we would treat the dogs better in a way than the humans, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy what we'll do for our animals, right? And you get into a lot of the veterinary work around horses and things like that, because my parents went to University of Kentucky. So, horse racing was sort of something that we watch. But yeah, it's amazing. It's just the dog sometimes gets treated better than we do, at least, from a public health level.
To try and get to the bottom of it. So that's the higher end in terms of if people have the budget to do those tests. And I've run those tests myself with clients. For somebody who wants to do it on more of a budget, what would you be looking at? Would you kind of go more holistic with questionnaires, or would you do limited testing?
Well, it depends on what that limited budget is, right? And so for me, the framework that I operate under, and I only work with a handful of people. Like I said, the majority of my time is spent on prescriptions, which we'll get into in a bit. But for somebody who's just looking to approach this in a low-cost manner, there's plenty of low-cost surveys that help bring awareness to what you're doing. So if you think about the majority of people, and I'm speaking about the majority, not the minority here. The question is, are they aware of the food that they're eating? Are they aware of how they're sleeping and how it makes them feel? And are they aware of things like stress? And so, how does stress affect them? And there's simple surveys, everything from, I like the Institute of Functional Medicine's multi-symptom questionnaire, which is just sort of an assessment that I actually still run qualitatively on myself once a month. And it allows you to assess sort of where your pain points are. There's also things like the Promise 10 Global, which allow you to track your improvements over time. there's things like the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality. I think this is the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, which I know our mutual friend Greg Potter is
Yeah.
a big fan of in terms of being able to bring awareness to sleep. So if you're saying, look, I have no budget for this, but I do want to start somewhere. Well, I'm a big fan of bringing awareness to what it is you're doing in everyday life, and then to establish correlations between some of the things you're doing, like maybe drinking a little bit too much wine at night and how you're sleeping, and then seeing those outcomes. So these little surveys, and frankly, back when I started in Quantified Self, it was basically me, a spreadsheet, because I was a banker and bankers love spreadsheets, and me, a spreadsheet, and just sort of saying, how do I feel today? 1 to 5. I had 4 glasses of wine last night. How did that make me feel? And you can start to bring awareness to that very, very quickly. And the good thing is that success is addictive, right? And so once you start to see some modicum of success, you're going to, hopefully look to double down on that success. And that could eventually bring you around to making a budget for testing.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know what I find? It's funny. Success is addictive, and health, don't you find, is addictive. And when you're working, there's no end to how far you can go. That's the thing. When you move away from disease and you start looking at health optimization, you start to feel better. Then people are like, "Oh my God, I love this. This feels amazing. What can I do now? What can I do now?" And it is very, very addictive. So let's look at transcriptions, because I've kind of played a little bit with a few transcriptions myself. People who follow me on Instagram will have seen my blue tongue and know that I was another Smurf.
I've got one right now.
You have one right now, do you?
I do.
So you've prepared for this interview, you do?
Well, one of the benefits is verbal fluency, and I think it's a necessity when you're getting interviewed. So.
Well, I should have had some before this interview, clearly. So let's break it down, because you've just released a new product, which is the blue, the methylene blue. Should we go through? Because I think people will be excited to hear about the ingredients. Obviously, the nicotine component isn't necessarily for everyone, and I think that's great that we can have it now both ways. But methylene blue, I mean, I saw Dave Asprey talking about how he uses it as an anti-aging serum and puts it on his face, and actually is careful not to use too much, otherwise his face turns blue. But why don't we start with methylene blue and how that works?
Angela, if it's okay, I want to explain sort of transcription's position in all of this.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So the way we look at product development and transcriptions is going back to the framework of health optimization, medicine, and practice. What we're actually practicing there is something called nutrient balancing and or hormone balancing, if you can prescribe. And nutrient balancing, for the most part, takes a little bit of time. It usually takes 3 months. But oftentimes you have a client that comes up to you and is immediately experiencing something, right? And so they're experiencing things like pain, anxiety, insomnia, in certain cases, short-term memory loss from things like jet lag. And so when we were looking at product development in terms of blue cannatine, and just blue, if you will, what we were looking at there was actually solving Dr. Ted's issue, and candidly mine as well, and many global travelers around the world, is that when you start to travel around the world with a degree of frequency, what you actually do is you start to notice things like memory loss. And that's not great when, one, you're reliant so much on your memory to do various things, but also when you need to perform right after getting off the plane. And so when we're looking for, or Dr. Ted was really looking for solutions with this, what he eventually arrived at was the formulation that became blue cannatine. And so you can suspect that in the future, what we're actually going to be doing is looking at some of those other points that I mentioned, pain, anxiety, insomnia, and looking at ways to deal with those. Because after all, everything that transcriptions does goes to serve sort of that framework of health optimization, medicine, and practice. So you asked a question about Big Blue and methylene blue. And so methylene blue is just one of these fascinating compounds that I'm a nerd for history. And so just going back in the history of methylene blue, it's been around for over 120 years. It was actually the first chemical compound approved by the FDA. And in 1891, it was used for the treatment of malaria. It's an antiviral, it's an antifungal. It's also been studied for use in things like neurocognitive decline or neurodegeneration. It's been studied pre-COVID-19 for the use of its effects and benefits against treatment of coronaviruses. And so that's a very fascinating compound. And by the way, it was used in World War II with General MacArthur in the South Pacific. And what's interesting is that most of the troops there complained about how bad it tasted, right? Which, to be fair, pure methylene blue does not taste very good at all. And so when we're looking at it from a transcriptions perspective, what are the benefits of methylene blue that we enjoy? And one of it is this idea of mitochondrial respiration. So methylene blue serves as an electron donor. Going down the chain, what does that actually lead to? It leads to an increase in ATP in the body, adenosine triphosphate being an energy currency of the body. That's very fascinating, right? It's also very beneficial when it comes to memory and just really looking at ways to boost memory. Some of the studies out there have really just looked at just so much when it comes to enhancing brain function, that it's just a fascinating compound. And so when we were looking at methylene blue, we included 5 milligrams of it in the first product, which was blue cannatine, and we included 16 in the just blue. Now, it's just such a fascinating compound, and it's still used today in the hospitals for things like, and I'm going to try and pronounce this right, methagglomemia, which is essentially when it's very hard to get oxygen in the cells. Methylene blue doesn't help that. It also helps with elderly patients and urinary tract infections.
So if it's helping get oxygen into the cells, then when people are having, because one of the main things I remember, and we're seeing less of it now because not so many people, certainly here in the UK, in the hospitals at the moment, but one of the things that came out with coronavirus is that when they were on ventilators, they were getting the oxygen into the lungs, but then the transfer wasn't taking place. So actually oxygenating the tissues wasn't really very effective. So people were getting things like multiple organ failure. Are you saying that methylene blue actually helps to increase oxygenation of the tissues?
So it certainly does, and in many cases. Now, there hasn't been studies of it against COVID-19. I know that there are people that are investigating that, but there hasn't been studies released. What we do know is that prior to COVID-19, it was studied as a mechanism for the treatment of other coronaviruses.
Okay, interesting. And in terms of just so people can kind of understand the mechanism without getting too sciencey. So it's donating an electron. So is it also then helping reduce oxidative stress in the body?
It does. And so it actually has sort of this auto-oxidation feature that it's a fascinating chemical. And I had the pleasure of somebody that I should connect you to, Angela, is Dr. Francisco Gonzalez Lima. I've had him on my podcast. Okay. And he's one of the foremost experts on cytochrome oxidase, and looking at methylene blue, it's an auto-oxidant feature. So when your body needs an electron, it donates it. When it needs to take away, it'll take it away. And it's a few chemicals out there.
It's adaptive.
Yes.
Amazing. That's interesting. And you were saying like you've taken it before this interview because it enhances verbal fluency, and you were looking there a little bit at cognition as well, anyway, in terms of like links with Alzheimer's. How is it doing that specifically in terms of improving brain function?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at what it's been studied for is how it improves spatial memory. And so there was a study that actually looked at just spatial memory specifically among a smaller population, and saw that low dose methylene blue actually had a benefit for improving spatial memory. What you mentioned there was verbal fluency, and I actually attribute some of the verbal fluency to come from another ingredient in the product, blue cannatine, that is, which is nicotine.
Oh, okay, that's that. So we'll come to that. So by spatial memory, you mean in terms of recollecting things in time and space? So events,
Correct.
long-term memory.
And well, in short, it does have
And short time where
benefits.
you've left something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so connecting those things to, interesting. And so if we're looking, before we get onto the blue cannatine, which obviously contains many more ingredients, in terms of taking just the methylene blue on its own, does that come on its own? It's just methylene blue, is it?
Yeah,
In that
so
one?
Just Blue is the second product that we produce. And actually, this was using a finance term, reverse inquiry. So it was a reverse inquiry from all of our Smurfs, if you will, that were asking for a product that didn't have caffeine in it and didn't have nicotine predominantly. Those were the two requests.
Okay.
There was also requests of people that saw some of these studies going out of methylene blue and neurodegenerative issues. And so what we did is we created a troche, a buccal troche, and we can go into what that means here in a minute. But that is 16 milligrams of methylene blue.
And so when would I take, because you very kindly sent me a few of these Just Blues to try, when would I take them, and what kind of period would I expect to see a benefit? So what's the best way to optimize the use of them?
Sure. So let's talk specifically about Just Blue first.
Yeah.
And then we'll get into blue cannatine a little bit later. So Just Blue comes in the form of buccal troche, which a buccal troche, just for people that are unfamiliar with it, is something, think of it as a lozenge, but we stick it between our upper lip and our gum, and it dissolves there. Now, you asked a question about when you would take it and how long does it last. So as it's dissolving, it typically takes between 15 and 30 minutes for people to feel an effect and for it to dissolve. Now, when it dissolves fully, you have what we refer to in blue cannatine as the limitless experience for 4 to 6 hours. Now, with Just Blue, the beauty of Just Blue, and I, like many others, enjoy my coffee, and the added caffeine of blue cannatine can sometimes put me over my caffeine limit. So sometimes, and many days, I'll use Just Blue. And the beauty of Just Blue is that we can really isolate some of those benefits of methylene blue, and it doesn't necessarily have that wakefulness promotion. So you don't have to necessarily worry about the time of day. Just to give you an example, when we were doing a launch party for Just Blue with many of our Smurf fans, if you will, I took Just Blue before that launch party. It was 9 p.m. at night in Amsterdam. Really no issues getting to bed because there wasn't any sort of caffeine or adenosine receptor blocking, if you will.
Interesting. Okay. So actually, if you really want to kind of be on top form and you've got something in the evening, that's a good time to take it. And you say that the effects last around 4 to 6 hours. So how many times, like, can you overdose? How many times a day could you take it?
So we recommend to people that take no more than 4 troches a day with both Just Blue and blue cannatine. Really, the side effect of both is the blue tongue. And so if you can tolerate a blue tongue, taking 4 troches a day is totally possible.
Okay. If you can tolerate it, if you don't feel that you're going to look too odd in your corporate meetings.
I guess. Well, the question is, why does it matter anymore when we're all virtual, right?
Yeah.
And if blue is the new smart, as we like to say, it's just a way for me, I use it for a lot of strategic thinking, right? And so it allows me to access memory, and it helps me think a little bit wider, specifically that case blue cannatine. But with Just Blue, when you really need to hone in on something and do some work and some focus work, I find it very effective for that.
So for that mental focus, have you noticed anything if you've taken it in the evening with dream sleep?
Not specifically with me, but okay. I'm trying to think of just in terms of some of the effects that I've seen with methylene blue, not necessarily in dream sleep, but I have seen it with meditations. And so when you take methylene blue, or Just Blue in this case, I have found myself in deeper meditations for sure.
I'm going to try that then. That's interesting. So as in, you found that you can get into a deeper kind of almost transcendental state, that you slip into it more easily, or that you can hold that and have a kind of clearer mind for longer? What have you noticed there?
A little bit of both, actually. But let's talk about just sort of the onset of meditation. Usually, let's say I meditate in the middle of the day, there's 1,000 things going on and you sit down to meditate. And usually it takes a period of time in order for that meditation in order for you to just sort of settle in, if you will. That period of time for me is much shorter.
Interesting. I'm going to try that actually then before my afternoon meditation, because interesting, you can stack those together then, right? Because what I find is that actually a lot of people say, oh, I don't have time to do the meditation. The meditation in and of itself gives you another kind of really good 4 to 5 hours productivity, I've found, and makes you more efficient. So stacking those two together, I'm going to have a play with that. That sounds fun.
What's funny is about meditation, you know, Russell Simmons, who founded Def Jam Records, said, if you don't have time, he had somebody that told him, you know, I don't have time to meditate. And he's like, well, then you need 3 hours to meditate, right? Yeah. I find it to be one of those Archimedes levers in my productivity as well.
I do. And I also find that it really helps with emotional regulation.
Absolutely.
For me. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. And clarity of thinking as well. When you're both creativity, I find, and mental clarity, just the clutter is gone. And I find that, because some people get frustrated, I think, a slight side issue here, but they get frustrated with meditation because they're like, I can't quieten the mind. And sometimes you can get into what's known, I guess, as the bliss field much more easily. And then other times it seems impossible, but actually the effects afterwards are still very, very profound. They're almost better, because I find that moving of the thoughts up and out is what then leads to that clarity later on in the day, because you've kind of let everything bubble up and gone. So I don't actually think you can have a bad meditation, quote unquote.
I completely agree with you. Anytime I spend meditating, it usually pays off 3 to 5x than what the time I did.
Same here. So on now the Just Blue has obviously like triple, I've written down here pretty much, more, just over triple the blue that's in the Blue Cannatine. So before we get into the Blue Cannatine, what would be, apart from the fact that we're not having the nicotine and the caffeine, and we've got these benefits in terms of cognition and focus from the blue, is there a certain time that you would say, actually, you're better off going with Just Blue here, above and beyond things like it's not going to interrupt the sleep? For example, if you're having it in the evening, would you use, like, if we were looking at, say, getting into a flow state, so you've got a big bit of writing, for example, that you want to do, or you're something that's very creative, is one of these going to work better than the other?
Yeah, I usually prefer Blue Cannatine for the flow state effect. If you really want to get locked in, I find Blue Cannatine to be a little bit more effective for that. When it comes to just Blue, I love Just Blue because, again, there's no time constraint there. If I need that little boost in the evening to just get my brain, revved up a little bit, it's there, and it dissolves really quickly. I only take a half a troche, and we can talk about dosing here in a little bit, but a half a troche does just very, very well for me.
Now, when you say half a troche, they come in like a 4, don't they? I don't have one here. Do you have one there?
Yeah, we can explain it. So just for anybody who's watching the video, and I have the little bag here, but picture a troche as, hosting a podcast, sometimes I become good at describing things in audio as well. So picture a troche as just a square, and it's a square lozenge that, again, you stick into your upper lip and it dissolves. Ours comes pre-quartered. It's not separated, but you can, bite it off or slice it off however you will. And we always recommend people, whether it is Blue Cannatine or whether it is Just Blue, to start with a half, and really dependent on, muscle mass, but also caffeine, particularly Blue Cannatine, caffeine tolerance, and whether or not you're a heavy meditator. Really depends on if you need to go above a half or perhaps decrease your dosage.
Okay, so that would be like 2 of the little cubes, basically.
Exactly.
Because I remember when I first tried the Blue Cannatine, I had a complete newbie. I think I had all 4, and it was on an empty stomach. I went for a run, and I felt a bit nauseous. So the team were like, okay, that maybe is a lot for you. You mentioned muscle mass there. Does it depend at all on weight and size? So I'm fairly slight. Like, would I need slightly less than, say, someone who was bigger than me?
I mean, Angela, we can talk a little bit about you specifically in terms of caffeine. How much caffeine are you currently
So I
intaking?
think then I'd also had a coffee in prep for that run. So I probably had too much caffeine, which I do find will cause a bit of gastric and irritation if I do that. I tend to have 2 coffees in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
which is a shot of espresso that I have at home, my own beans. So what would that be? That would be
Two
not
shots.
that much.
I
Two
mean,
shots. It's not that much caffeine, I don't think.
so a double espresso is 80 milligrams of caffeine. In Blue Cannatine, you get 50. Um,
Okay.
so, so it's very interesting. So let's go back to just dosing and dosing protocols, right? And so if you're smaller, yeah, there's a chance that you probably need a little bit less of it. We have people, bodybuilders like Chris Gethin, that have tried it, and he's got so much muscle mass as well as intake of caffeine that he needs 2 in order to get started, 2 whole turkeys, that is.
Oh, wow.
But some people, myself included, only really need a half, and it really depends on what I outlined before, which is your caffeine tolerance, but also how much of a meditator you are, as well as muscle mass.
So explain that. How does how much of a meditator you are make a difference?
It's funny. There's nothing really scientific about it other than we
Yeah.
observed among our population of Smurfs that people who are heavy meditators tend to need it a little bit less than others.
Okay. Maybe because they can access their mental state a little bit more easily on demand.
I mean, hypothetically, yes.
Hypothetically. And why does muscle mass make a difference specifically? Like, does body fat also have an impact, or because you mentioned muscle mass specifically there?
Yeah, it's again a little bit out of my wheelhouse for that one, but I think just the larger you are, it may be harder for it to absorb into certain tissues, but that's all.
Okay. So blue cannatine obviously has the caffeine, so 50 milligrams, and it also has nicotine, which you were mentioning earlier, helps with the verbal fluency. And it has a little bit of hemp, right? So
Yeah, so hemp crystals beatifically derived is what we like to call it.
beatifically derived.
Mm-hmm.
So does it contain how much hemp is in it, I guess?
So it's 5 milligrams of hemp crystals beatifically derived, and you can look at that as something it's similar-ish to CBD. And so it's a relatively micro amount. So if you think about blue cannatine as a whole, what we did was we took micro amounts of each ingredient, combined them together to get a more beautiful effect, if you will. And so when we look at things like methylene blue, well, the dose dependent curve says greater than 5 milligrams per kilogram is probably where you're going to end up in doing more harm to yourself than good. And we only have 5 milligrams in one turkey. We also limit people to 4 turkeys a day. When it comes to nicotine, we have 1 milligram, and I can spend a little bit of time on nicotine if you want in a little bit. We have 5 milligrams of something called hemp canna, and then we have, of course, 50 milligrams of caffeine.
Okay. And so the caffeine, you say, helps with the verbal fluency. It also helps it just like that waking up, being more alert.
Caffeine, the world's nootropic, right? Like
yeah, it is. It's
everybody loves
amazing.
it's such a good, I love coffee, and much like you, I have my espressos in the morning. But it's a nootropic that we're all familiar with, and we use it to help with alertness.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of the hemp, does that contain any THCs? Is it full spectrum? How does that work?
There's no THC in it because you can't export THC. Now, prescriptions itself may look at producing THC products in the future, but that would be for distribution in places like California. But blue cannatine is 100% non-THC, and so think of it as like CBD. And what we use it for, and have hypothesized, is that if you take something like a nicotine, if you take nicotine, there's a very sharp rise. And so hemp canna helps round off that rise so that you don't necessarily feel that sharp. I've had friends describe it as a headache from taking pure nicotine. And so what it does is it helps really round it out and extend the feeling.
Okay, so it's almost getting that release a little bit more slowly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. And the nicotine you say is 1 milligram, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't smoke, but to compare it, how much nicotine is in a cigarette? Because that's what people will be most familiar with. Like,
Yeah.
um,
So I believe, so the absorbable nicotine in a cigarette, so that's not total nicotine, that's the absorbable one, is around 2 milligrams per cigarette, right? Now,
okay.
when we look at, let's just talk about, because I feel the question behind the question here, right, Angela, is that, like, when we start talking about nicotine, everybody's like, okay, are you going to get addicted to it, right?
Mm,
And so, is nicotine addictive? Yes, it is. But that also depends on the mechanism of intake. And so, smoking has a higher likelihood of passing the blood-brain barrier, but there's other things in cigarettes that really help optimize for the addiction, if you will. When you look at other ways of taking it, you have sort of the sprays or the inhalers, if you will. And then you have things like lozenges and then edibles. And
skin
so,
patches as well.
yeah, skin
Yeah.
patches too. And so, speaking to other doctors, we've got cases of people that are on skin patches for decades and haven't really had any issues, if you will. But if you look at just kind of addiction properties there that I just laid out, so it goes from most addictive being the smoking to least addictive being somewhat of an edible, if you will. And what we have is the buccal mucosa. And so what we're doing is we're absorbing or kind of bypassing some of our digestive systems. And we're only giving you 1 milligram. So if you look at what the New England Journal of Medicine has said, as well as some of my conversations with experts in the world, like Dr. Neil Grunberg, the question that I always have is what amount of nicotine is considered an addictive amount? And it's usually what they've both arrived at is somewhere between 5 and 8 milligrams per day. We limit you at 4. So if you think about it that way, we try to minimize that as much as possible. But we want the benefits of nicotine because you and I are both in the biohacking space for a long time. We know that there's many, many benefits of it.
Yeah, many benefits. And the other thing is, so you're bypassing digestion here, and basically it's sublingual, right? So the idea is that you let this slowly. Now, I think that is the other thing. It tastes nice and minty. So I think that the temptation can be to slightly chew it. So
Mhm.
how long should it take you? Should you be, because you mentioned as well, I thought it was to be sucked on, but you mentioned that it should really be between your gum and your upper lip. So it's kind of up underneath here, right?
Exactly.
That's where you would put
So
it.
buccal troches have been used in the medical world for a very long time for things like oxytocin and others. But it's a relatively new delivery system for particularly the biohacking space. And so when you take a troche, you stick it in your upper lip and you let it dissolve. Uh, Ideally, when you let it dissolve, you enter into something called half smurf mode, which is when your tongue is half dyed. But some people like to swish it around in the top of their mouth. And in order to really get the most effective experience with blue cannatine or just blue, we do recommend that you try to limit the interactions with saliva, and you don't really want to chew it or swallow it.
Okay. And you were saying, so ideally you get the half tongue because you're just keeping it on one side.
Mhm.
What's the reason for that? Is it just to limit that saliva like intermingling? If you move it even around the top lip, then you're getting more saliva? Or is there a
Perfect.
benefit? Yeah. Okay.
Perfect, Angela, you got it.
Okay. Right. Okay. So, and it's the same for the just blue as well.
Exactly. So you want to let it dissolve on one side, ideally. We do have people that like to go full Smurf, and we encourage you to do what you like to a certain extent. We certainly don't want you to swallow it, but it's if you move it around, you'll end up with a full tongue, and so you can give Gene Simmons a run for his money.
Um, I like that. Okay. So, and the other thing the team mentioned to me actually when I tried it and I felt slightly nauseous was I was having too much, but also not to have it on an empty stomach. Is that right? Can that make a difference?
It can in some people. Like,
Okay.
for instance, first, when I look at your particular scenario, for first time users, we always recommend starting with a half or even a quarter of a troche, depending on your sensitivity. And so in your case, it just may have been the fact that you just took too much the first time. But yes, it could have some impact if you do have some food in your stomach, from preventing things like nausea.
Okay. And are there any interactions that you can't take it with certain things?
Very good question. So SSRIs are, methylene blue in general with SSRIs is something that you would want to avoid. Part of that is just because a methylene blue does have MAOI properties. And so SSRIs are the one that we usually guide people to, which in certain aspects does mean that those who are users of things like psychedelic medicine, you shouldn't necessarily take the two together.
Okay. And is this because the methylene blue, when you mentioned the SSRI, so that's having some kind of impact in terms of serotonin levels, presumably?
Correct. And so what it could potentially lead to is, and again, this is relatively few and far between, but it could potentially lead to serotonin syndrome. And so we don't want anybody to experience that.
Yeah. Okay. I can't really see a reason why somebody would do this, but you did mention you can have just blue in the evening. So what would be the interaction that you mentioned a party if someone has it with a glass of wine? Would it interact with alcohol in any way?
I've personally, I've tried that, but it was with natural wine and I haven't noticed any sort of effect, but nothing really. I think the question I would ask is, if you're using a nootropic, you're potentially looking to enhance your brain functions, presumably for a given task, unless you're using methylene blue every single day, which is more looking at mitochondrial health and those kind of things. And so if you're using a nootropic to get something done, does alcohol help in that, is the question that I would be asking those people.
Yeah, no. And in that sense, actually, almost it would be like creating a friction. Okay. And what about, I guess I have two more questions. One is, do the benefits increase over time? Is it something that you need to be consistent? We talked about using it for a task, but does consistency help? So with things like lion's mane, actually just doing one-offs, the results are not so good as if you're consistently having it. How does that work with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't studied it yet. And it's something that we're actually running an experiment with now in terms of some of our fan population, is just sort of what kind of the long-term implications of methylene blue use are, as well as blue cannatine use. We do have a couple of customers that use it every single day, and I know because I see their orders come through. But by and large, most of the population uses it for very specific tasks in order to, roll up the sleeves and get stuff done. And so we find it very, very interesting for that. Now, I mean, hypothetically, does methylene blue is a benefit to the mitochondria. And so if you have continuous use of it over time, could that benefit build over time? Absolutely. But it hasn't really been studied to my knowledge at this moment.
Okay. And what about any kind of attenuation? So I know, like with a lot of nootropics, for example, they'll say to take it for 5 days and then have a break for 2 days so you don't get that attenuation. Is that something that's a concern, or could you take this every day and still get the same benefits?
Yeah, it's theoretically, you could. We don't have too many people doing that, but yes, I believe you could get the same benefits every single day. Now, the question is over time, I guess you use attenuation, which also means tolerance, right? And so over time, do you build up some sort of tolerance to the blue cannatine? And that is possible. So maybe I should re-record my answer and say that is possible.
Yeah, so it's maybe better to take it, I guess, as well, unless you're looking at the effects of on mitochondrial health. There isn't a reason, right? In the same way we shouldn't be on every single day, because then we're not getting that recovery. Yeah. This is only just helping us switch on more. So I kind of just want to finish then breaking down the kind of things that people are looking for when they're looking at optimization. So obviously we've got, and then looking at whether it would be blue cannatine or methylene blue in these scenarios, just so people can understand how to use them and the sort of timing before. I think you mentioned, is it the case with both of them that you want to allow about 15 to 30 minutes to have the full effects of it?
Mhm.
So let's say, I'll give you some, I'll throw out some scenarios. So somebody on this occasion, they actually just have to get through a lot of volume of work. So it's maybe more of an admin based day and they just want to power through and complete all of their tasks on productivity. Which one would they opt for?
For a situation like that, blue cannatine I found to be very, very effective for the locked in feeling, if you will. And so if you have a situation like that, where you need to be locked in and just running through a boatload of tasks, yes, blue cannatine can be very, very helpful.
You just want to get stuff done. And then you mentioned as well, if you want to get into more of a flow state, blue cannatine is also better. So
Yeah. So both. So it's interesting because you're asking a very good question as to when should I use blue cannatine versus just blue. And blue cannatine I find is sort of that wide focus, meaning that I can get a lot of things done, but I haven't really shut off the world behind around me. Whereas just blue is something more like a clear focus, which is if I have that one or two things right in front of me, I can certainly get those done and be able to just work through the rest of my day.
So it's kind of like the just blue helps you to zone in a little bit better. Whereas if you want to keep that wider focus, the blue cannatine. And so for meditation, it's the just blue, presumably.
Um, well, you can use both, and this
Okay.
again is very dependent on the person. But I found blue cannatine to be very, very effective with meditation as well.
Have you? Interesting. Okay. And what about if you're taking other nootropics, other natural compounds? Is there any reason why you can't put the two together?
Uh, I am just trying to think of ones off the top of my head that I take, and I'll take ashwagandha daily, and I won't worry about that interacting with blue cannatine. Although functions more like an adaptogen in some cases, but I necessarily I'm not a massive fan of stacking too many things, but there aren't too many contraindications when it comes to the ingredients in blue cannatine or just blue, other than the SSRIs, which I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, sure. And I guess another question I have, this has kind of come to me, is what about exercise? Can you use this prior to kind of going and hitting that workout?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that because I just did a workout right before this. And one of the things that I find with exercise is that for longer workouts where it is required to be more methodical, I'm actually much more relaxed. And so I'm more relaxed in the pacing. And if you think of something like Murph and CrossFit in terms of the length of that workout, I find it to be very, very useful with that. I also use it for, you can see right behind me, my Carol bike, and I will use it on those sprints as well. So I found it, yeah, very, very effective in terms of rather than going at a workout and just going all out, it actually helps me pace a lot better.
Okay, so works very well then for an endurance-based workout,
Mm-hmm.
or if you were doing kind of higher volume, lower repetition, higher repetition, lower weight training, for example, but less so. But then you mentioned sprints as well, right? So it works for power-based workouts as well.
Well, it does, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting.
And the way I kind of look at that is if we go back to the idea of focus, is if you're bringing focused awareness to your workout, whether it be power or endurance, I find it to be very, very effective for those types of workouts.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Probably quite good as well if you've got a long drive.
It's I was driving from Amsterdam down to Belgium, it was about a 7-hour drive. And so during that time, I did take blue cannatine because it is very, very effective for just being on the road, right?
Yeah. And so if you've taken it, say, for example, you took 1/4 and then you weren't really noticing the effects, would you then take another one? And do you find that sometimes, like, I know you take a half, do you then leave it like the 4 to 5 hours, or do you sometimes take a little bit more on top within that window?
Personally, I just will only take a half and I don't top up at the end, if that's what you're asking. What we usually recommend with people is to see the dose the full way through. And then the next time you're going to dose yourself, increase it. So let's say you take a quarter and you're not noticing an effect over the course of that 4 to 6 hours. The next time you want to take blue cannatine, well, okay, increase it to a half and then see what it does for you.
Okay. And what about people? I think you have an age limiter on your site. I think you have to be 18 years old. So this is not something that students under the age of 18 should be using.
Well, correct. There's nicotine in blue cannatine. There's nicotine in it. And we just, in general, recommend people under the age of 18 consult. Well, you can't use it if there's nicotine in it.
Yeah. Okay. But even the methylene blue, it's better to stay away if you're underage. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. That was fascinating. I'm trying to think if there's any more questions, but I've asked so many that I hopefully for the listeners have asked lots of questions that will answer them. I guess the last thing is, where can you find them? Because initially they weren't readily available in the UK. Pure Health Supplements, I believe, stock them.
Yeah, so we have a sort of agreement with Pure Health Supplements in the UK, and they have both blue cannatine and just blue. And so if you're in the UK, you can use the code Angela10 and you'll get yourself a 10% discount. But if you're in the US, of course, triscriptions.com is the way to go. And if the same code works for a 10% discount.
Brilliant. Amazing. So I will link to all of that in the show notes. And also, where can people find out more about you on Boomer? I know that we connected over Instagram, but please link to where they can find out more about you.
Yeah, it's everything about me is under Decoding Superhuman. So the podcast, the website, the Instagram, as you mentioned, that's where you can find me.
Awesome. So before you go, what would be your final top 3 tips for becoming superhuman?
Oh, such a good question.
It's always hard to distill things down into 3, isn't it? And I'm sure there are more, but if you could pick the 3 that you think.
Number 1, I think, would be measure. So when it comes to just looking at the world right now, you're getting bombarded with information. All of us are experiencing information overload. But how do you create a filter for yourself to determine what is useful for me and what is useful or not useful to me, and I can just kind of cast off? And that's where measurement comes into play. Some of these frameworks that you and I talked about earlier are certainly possible, but I just encourage everyone really to measure and to focus on just kind of getting the data of you right first. And so once you have that data, you'll be able to really glance at what is right for you and what's not. Number 2 is stress well. And what do I mean by that? Because I have a history of perfectionism and anxiety. And so what do I mean by stress well? And I guess you can actually call this hyphenated meditation. So how do we perceive stress? Because stress is not going away. If you're a high performer, and presumably everybody listening to the show is, stress is not going away. And so how do you adapt to stress? How do you take stress and become stronger as a result, or become anti-fragile, using the words of Taleb? Well, that requires building resilience. And one of the most effective tools that I've found in terms of building resilience is presence, but also building presence through meditation. And number 3 is always the hardest one, because there's so many things that I, want to go into here. And we can either go eat or sleep, something to do with eating or something to do with sleeping, but I'm going to go with sleep. And so if you want to become superhuman, sleep is very important. I'm sure you get a lot of these people, and I used to be one of these people who would come to you and say, like, I sleep 4 to 6 hours a night and I don't have time to do anything else, right? But the fact is we know through the study of things like lymphatics that your brain functions at its absolute best when you're sleeping. And so what I always recommend to people is to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And a lot of that will help determine how the rest of your day goes. And so in some ways, 2 and 3 actually do serve each other. So I find that when I have resilience, when I have presence, when I stress well, if you will, that I do sleep a hell of a lot better.
Yeah, for sure. And then the sleep also helps you in turn become more resilient and handle things.
Absolutely.
Those are amazing. I prioritize those, and sleep is a big one for me. You can't leave us on a cliffhanger though now, because you said I can go eat or sleep. So now we have to hear what your what was your eat?
Yeah. So I look at diets, and it's kind of funny because we get very dogmatic about diets, right? And now carnivore is very trendy. A year ago it was keto. Uh, a year or two before that it was paleo, and there's almost this kind of cult like bandwagon behind these, and all of these are good for certain types of people. But the fact is that um, certain types of people it may not be good for. And so what are some basic principles that people can go by when it comes to diet before they measure? Well, eating real food is a good start, and just looking at the ingredients, and if you can't pronounce it, it probably doesn't really belong in your body. And so looking at meat, fish, vegetables, and good healthy fats, so olive oil, avocado oil, in certain cases butter if you don't have a lactose issue, ghee, and the like, and using those as sort of foundations for your diet is a great way to get started in that. Now, number one, measurement will help you optimize that in terms of what it means for you. But that's just a good foundational principle for people to go by until they have the means to figure out a little bit more about themselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, again, it comes back to your first point, which is actually like tracking data.
Yeah.
As soon as you have data, and even just that simple exercise of working out how you felt after you ate a food, like 30 minutes afterwards and 2 hours can give you tremendous insights into how your body is reacting to it. Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed that, and I'm sure the listeners have too. And I will link to everything that we've spoken about in the show notes, including where they can get these transcriptions, which I highly recommend trying. I'm going to definitely play around with a bit of the Pure Blue over the next few days. And so thanks again, Boomer. It's amazing to have you on the show.
Angela, it's so good to, well, finally meet you and have this conversation.
Yes, for sure. Amazing. Thank you.